Okay, that's interesting. Well, the whole idea of being international, I just want to ask kind of a general question to have you talk about your experience working with other countries and crafting something that you hope will be acceptable to audiences who are really unfamiliar with the kind of topics that you're talking about and what kind of reactions you get from screening these films around the world. I mean, is it a certain culture would be more accepting? I have a sense that American audiences are probably a hard nut to crack because they're so Hollywood oriented. And I'm just going to kind of open it up to see what you might want to contribute about your experience that way. I'm assuming he's shaking her head like, yeah. Okay.
I mean, we're just so, I think American audiences are just completely brainwashed by corporate media that we're unable to see anything outside of that little bubble of myth, you know, created by the media.
And so the Cleveland International Film Festival
It's
helps.
a great venue, of course, of course.
I wouldn't say that, and I look at it differently. I'm sure I'm not going to disagree with the domination by corporate media, and if you stay in a hotel that has limited TV channels, you see how awful that media is. I think the real problem is not so much that the audiences are not receptive to films. I think that there's no business plan to bring anything that really deviates from the sort of standard spectrum of things. And I find that when you do get an audience into all sorts of films, it's okay. Things really move ahead from there. But I do think that the United States, the difficulty in the United, we were just talking about this. There's almost no television market for anything that's not in English. Well, if that's a fact, then you're excluding a tremendous amount of cinema or moving pictures from your audience. Uh-oh.
Speaking of which.
The Academy. Sorry about that. They told me not to say that. I really apologize. But my experience has been that, I mean, I could tell you stories. I also program part of a film festival in Israel, and it's really not the case. It's a very different situation. But I do believe that when you put something in front of an audience, you get people in, you advance significantly. And the problem is getting people who are willing to show something. Anyway,
the business plan, the marketing.
Anyway.
Yeah. So, Lise?
No, I just think that working in documentaries, I think that there is a very big difference in the tradition, because in some countries, like in my country, the documentary form is coming from an art form. We consider it filmmaking, just as we consider fiction feature films filmmaking. So we do much more creative documentaries than is the case for many other countries. And when you come from a country where documentary filmmaking comes out of television and it's much more factual, I think it's harder to cross borders, because you don't have if you're not English language, you don't have the festivals necessarily to promote your films, to get it showcased. And so to do creative documentaries means that it's easier, in my point of view, to penetrate foreign markets.
Documentaries are easier?
No, creative documentaries are easier.
Right.
Because they are considered, I mean, they can have forms that are, you know, can be recognized for the filmmaking also.
So it's not just recognized as a documentary, but it's a creative film that happens to be a documentary.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
I experienced the same thing in Switzerland, because maybe we're a small country too.
Bigger language though.
Yeah, and we have 3 languages. So, but it's true that we have masters of documentaries, and because we have not a lot of money to make films, a lot of people, they made documentaries and feature and fiction narrative films. And also it's very commercial, when it's come out in theaters, it works pretty well. And documentaries last year makes like, in a very 6 million, we make like 700,000 spectators for maybe 25 documentaries. So it's pretty big.
Well, how does it work in Switzerland as far as major theaters showing documentaries? Because I know that in France, for example, they have to make some kind of law that requires theaters to show a certain percentage of French films. Otherwise, they would just dominate with American films because they would make more money. So I wonder if they have to kind of offset that to make sure that audiences get to see homemade films.
We don't have the same rules in Switzerland.
Okay, that's
But
encouraging.
you have to compete with all the films.
Yeah.
That's it, because it works and they make money. You can, and you have other type of support. I don't want to get in, but it's
So
a
what,
bit
the
complicated.
government support, for example?
Yes, for the theaters.
Okay.
If they keep the films during a certain number of weeks, they have support.
Because I think that
for
might be a
each
key
team.
factor for a lot of the international productions. You know, who is kicking in to help pay for this? I don't know if that's a direction you want to go in, but it has to do with the marketing, the business plan, pleasing the audience too.
Well, yeah, I mean, that gets very complicated, but for example, and if you may all know this, one way of financing films up front is to have a commitment from one or more countries' television. But these are not the way that American films get financed. These are not the way that all but a small number of American independent films, feature or documentary, get financed. The other thing is, for example, you're making a film and you're making a documentary that involves using archival material. You may get a partnership with a television network in the country that figures in your story, and you get that archival material for free. You can save hundreds of thousands of dollars that way. So, I mean, there are many, I think that it's interesting. Filmmakers and producers have really made a lot of advances very imaginatively in getting films financed. I'll go back to what I said before. I think the application of the imagination has to be in finding ways to get them to an audience. I think that's still really lacking.
To simplify that, I mean, it's for those film students and audience, is the making a film versus distribution. It's another, it's a whole, I think the technology and everyone is, everyone can make a movie now, and for this budget, that budget, but very few people can get it seen. And there's a lot of talk about, you know, how many of your Netflix queues are filled up for months and months. You have so much choice. Why would you choose that film over this film, over that film, over that film? And there has to be a whole new way of thinking about how do you audience build and get your stuff to an audience. That's the key. And if you study, I had a discussion, black filmmakers are always trying to figure out, because if this is the general state of America, then what is happening for black filmmakers? Right. And there's a new program that Ava DuVernay is starting where she's getting her independent feature attached to small black film festivals and using their audiences and playing in AMC theaters. And I had a discussion with her about this before she started this program, and I said the only 2 times the black film has been really significant in this country have been during segregation and during the black exploitation movement. And why is that? Because during segregation, black people went to the theaters because they weren't allowed to go to the other theaters. So there was a market, there was a place, there were theaters designed for that. And then during the black exploitation movement, the studios were actually marketing and pushing and selling these films because they were trying to make money off of it. So something has to happen on the distribution side, or we just have to. That's where the issue really lies.
But bear in mind that the beginning of the blaxploitation era was with Melvin Van Peebles, with Sweetback's Badass Song, which I urge all of you to see. And
he's my mentor.
yeah, okay. So Melvin Van Peebles, very smart guy, very entrepreneurial guy, realized that an audience was not being served and released that film himself, rented flatbed trucks, did his own advertising, and people came, the audience came. And then the studio said, it was always like this. It's the same way that independent film is like a minor league team. You pick the best players, they leave, and the rest of them stick around, you know. That the big people always exploit, you know, what small people have made the sacrifices for. Big, I'm sure that you've never heard that before.
Yeah, essentially what Melvin did was four-walling for today, you know. I mean,
yeah, four-walling, but four-walling with a product that he knew would, you know, would be profitable.
Right.
That he recognized that there was an audience that was not being served, that was eager to see this, would pay money for it, and would pay enough money for him to make a profit.
And he drove around to different cities with the album. Earth, Wind and Fire made that album, did the soundtrack before they were Earth, Wind and Fire. And went around and played the album on these local radio stations to convince people to go to the theaters. I mean, this was revolutionary.
And the title, even for those days, okay, imagine, this was that era's version of John Waters' Pecker, right? It was a title people would say, wow, I gotta see this. You know, it was that kind of thing. And, well, you know, it's all documented.
But if I can say, I think that that kind of entrepreneurial thinking is actually very much something you have to have if you want to market documentaries. Because well, at least I don't know about Switzerland, but in most other countries there are no real outlets for documentaries. It's not like you can go to a distributor and say, okay, put this out. It's not happening that way. And for instance, last year I did a film called Burma Vijay, which ended up being Oscar nominated. And it was very hard to get that into theaters in the beginning because people felt that it was an obligation film, the kind of film where people feel that they ought to see it, but maybe not the choice they were actually going to make when they were in the ticket line. So we invented, together with the UK distributor, a completely different approach. We set up 40 screenings simultaneously all over Britain, and with an online video conference to the main theater. So if you can create, this is just one example, but if you can create this kind of event, you can actually get all the people in one day, and you can get a lot of extra media coverage, which means that it'll be more interesting for television and all these things. And I think that kind of thinking, you have to almost do that every time with a documentary, because there is no real sort of system.
So do you think that it wouldn't have been Oscar nominated if it hadn't had that kind of media attention? I mean, that really focused people's attention on it?
I can't say. I mean, is it
hard to get nominated?
It's the most award-winning film in Danish history ever. We've had 50 awards with the Peabody Award just 2 days ago. So I don't know. But it's the first time that I've had the U.S. market sort of run after me instead of me running after the U.S. market. So there was something special about that film, I would say.
Yeah.